Audiobook Academy. Book Summary. Mouse, A Survivor's Tale Part 1. By Art Spiegelman. A two-part graphic novel series authored by Art Spiegelman. Mouse, A Survivor's Tale Part 1. My Father Bleeds History is the first of the series. A monthly comic strip version of the strip was produced by Raw from December 1980 until its demise in 1991. The magazine published every chapter until the final one. He began searching for a publisher when the series was ended to make it into a graphic novel. One of the first graphic novels to be issued to a wider audience outside of comic shops was broken into two parts and released in 1991 in bookstores as one of the first such releases. The graphic books won the first Pulitzer Prize ever given to a graphic novel in 1992 after receiving high appreciation from critics. The Eisner Award, 1992, and Harvey Award, 1993, are only two of the many accolades it has received. 1992. Over 30 languages have been translated into this work, and it is now being taught frequently in German schools. The first 6 chapters of the series chronicle the narrative of Art Spiegelman and his inspiration to create a graphic novel based on his father's wartime experiences in Poland. The Jewish people are shown as mice, whereas the Germans and Polish people are depicted as pigs and cats in the fable. Because he was aware of Nazi propaganda that painted Jews as vermin, Spiegelman was determined to show the Jewish characters as mice. When World War II broke out, Wlodek, Art's father, was a Jew residing in Poland. As he tells his narrative, the man recounts how he witnessed his beloved nation succumb to the Nazis as he and his wife were forced to flee. Anya and her husband Wlodek are found and brought to Auschwitz at the end of the first part. First, there's a short prologue in which Art, as his mouse counterpart, recalls a narrative about his skate coming loose when he's skating with his friends. Art is left behind by his pals, who taunt him as they walk away from him. On his way back to the house, Art notices his dad working on something in the front yard. After noticing Art's tears, his father calls out to him to step forward and offer his assistance. In response to Art confessing that his friends have abandoned him, Art's dad tells him that they were clearly not his pals at all. Friends, if you lock them in a room for a week without food, you'll see what it is. Chapter 1, The Sheik. A title page introduces us to Art, who has just arrived at his father Wlodek's house. He wants to document his father's memories of the Holocaust for a biography of the man that he is planning to write. In an interview, he claims that he and his father have not seen each other in a long time. Because of his mother's death and the 2 heart attacks he's had afterwards, Art believes his father's appearance has changed since he last saw him. Since then, Art's father has remarried to Mala, a woman he met when living in Poland before the war. Vladimir leads Art to his old room where he has set up a gym full of training equipment after dinner. After a brief conversation, Art tells Wlodek that he wants to hear his narrative so that he may do an accompanying comic. His life narrative isn't intriguing enough for a book, and it would be too long, Wlodek tells him. As a result of Art's persistent questions, Wlodek finally agrees to begin the story. Częstochowa, a small Polish city near the German border, serves as the starting point. He worked in the textile industry when he was there. His tale of being pursued by many girls, some of whom he didn't even know, is relayed to Art by him. An old acquaintance named Yulk called and said that a woman named Lucia Greenberg was looking for an introduction to him. Wlodek agreed to meet with her and took her dancing. After this, he saw Lucia on the street frequently. Art stops his father's story at this point to remind him that his mother's name was actually Anna Zeilerberg, and not Lucia Greenberg. Wlodek warns him that if he doesn't pay attention, he'll miss the build-up. Although Wlodek didn't like Lucia, he agreed to let her into his home after Lucia insisted on it. Wlodek and Lucia dated for about 3 or 4 years after they first met and became friends. Wlodek claims that Lucia's family was decent, but poor and lacked a dowry. When Wlodek visits his family for the holidays, he hears from his cousin that he wants to set him up with a good girl in his class. That she's a smart and well-off woman is what Wlodek hears from him. Wlodek and Anya meet the next day. Anya assumes that Wlodek's cousin will be unable to comprehend her when she speaks in English about him. In the end, she is both impressed and ashamed when he discloses that he heard everything she said. Asked about his English education, he says he took private lessons after dropping out of school at 14 to work. Wlodek says he's always wanted to see the United States. In order for Wlodek to return to Częstochowa before Wlodek leaves again, The two of them exchange phone numbers and begin conversing daily. Anya started sending Vladik beautiful notes and a framed picture. As it turned out, his ex-girlfriend Lucia dropped by his house one day and noticed the framed portrait on the fireplace mantel. Lucia's mood was sour. Vladik had revealed to her that he had plans to wed Anya soon. When Lucia became furious, Vladik informed her that they should not be together. Vladik was introduced to Anya's family not long after that. The Zeilerberg family was well off since they owned one of Poland's largest hosiery manufacturers. But when Vladik came to visit, he was greeted like a king. The next time Anya asked him to help with supper, she let him peek into her closet to observe how well she kept the place clean. Although he found a bottle of medications in her closet, he was fascinated and noted down what they were so he could research them. Later, he learned from a fellow druggist that the medicines were prescribed to her solely for her nervousness and extreme thinness. Vladik and Anya got engaged at the end of 1936, and he moved to her hometown of Sosnowiec from Częstochowa. They wed in the spring of 1937. As a result of this, they moved into the home of Anya's father. Lucia urged Vladik to return her and leave Anya before he forgot to mention it in his monologue of how he met Anya and how they became engaged. That Vladik was a cheater, she wrote to Anya, telling her of this. Because of her disappointment, Anya refused to speak to Vladik for several days until he was able to reach her and clarify the issue. That backstory should not be included in the comic, says Vladik to Art. In response to Art's inquiry, Vladik explains that, in no way, shape, or form does it have anything to do with Hitler. Following the show for more information, please see the following link. He is told by Art that it is excellent material that enhances the realism of the story. Art vows to omit it, despite Vladik's insistence that it be included. Chapter 2, The Honeymoon. Throughout the next 6 months, Art visits his father's house on a regular basis to hear the story unfold. When Art's father next sees him, he is dispensing his medication, and he says that he has a condition. When Art inquires about his mother's previous relationships, Vladik reveals that she had a communist boyfriend. Despite the fact that they were married, Anya was eager to see him whenever he came to town. Shortly after their marriage, Vladik learned that Anya had been interpreting communist communications for the man's benefit. Despite the fact that the police had uncovered this and were ready to arrest her, she was informed of their plans by a friend before she was taken into custody. When Anya was desperate to hide the communist documents she took them to the seamstress down the hall and requested her to keep them safe. The seamstress was arrested by the police after they discovered the documents in her home. Because there was no additional proof linking her to the items, she was released from prison 3 months later. When Vladik realized that Anya was a communist spy, he considered divorce. Her choice was between him and her communist buddies after he informed her she had to make a choice. The seamstress's attorneys were paid for by Anya's father. To help support any children they may have, he started talking to Vladik about founding a textile factory. A textile plant in Bielsko was set up by Vladik, and he would visit Anya there every weekend. Anya gave birth to a son, Richu, later that year. In Vladik's account, Art never met Richu because the latter was killed in action. After the birth of the child, Anya remained in Bielsko with her family while Vladik went to work. However, due to Anya's postpartum depression, Vladik was forced to return home. Vladik accompanied her to the sanitarium where her parents had advised she be admitted, with the child being cared for by a governess. Everyone on the train to the sanitarium in Czechoslovakia suddenly became agitated. In the town square, a Nazi flag was flying as Vladik went outside to have a look. He'd never seen one before, so he was amazed. On the train, a man begins to relate the story of his cousin, who was expelled from Germany by the Nazis because he was a Jew. Before a war breaks out, they hope that the Nazis will be ousted from power. Arriving at the sanitarium, Vladik and Anya are given a luxurious room with an excellent outlook. Every morning, the nurses come to see Anya, and Vladik makes it a point to check in with the specialist to see how she was doing. As a result of his concern for Anya, Vladik sought to keep her busy and happy. Anya was able to return home after 3 months of recovery. As a result, Vladik's father informs him that his factory was looted and all of his belongings were stolen. In response to Art's question about whether the robbery of his father's factory was related to anti-Semitism, Vladik says he doesn't believe it was. After a few months of aid from Anya's father, Vladik was able to restore the plant and start making money again. Bielsko saw a rise in Nazi involvement. Sosnowiec can always be a safe haven if things grow any worse, says Wlodek when Anya consider moving elsewhere. When Art asks why they believed Sosnowiec would be more secure than Bielsko, Wlodek responds that they believed Hitler would only want to annex areas of Poland that were once part of Germany before the First World War, such as Bielsko. Art is puzzled. Before being called up, Wlodek and Anya remained in Bielsko for another year. To ensure that Anya may return to her parents' house and that Wlodek can serve in the war, the family packs up whatever they can. Wlodek spills his prescription bottle and begins to inform Art about his health problems at this moment, by unintentionally. Wlodek suggests that they continue the story at a later time. Chapter 3, Prisoner of War. When Wlodek's regiment was formed in 1939, it was given only a few days of instruction before being deployed to the front. Wlodek reveals that he was in the Army Reserves and that he had previously undergone the training years before, which surprises Art. As a prisoner of war, Wlodek is sent to Nuremberg, where he is singled out because he is Jewish. They were startled to find so much money in Wlodek's pocket when the Jewish detainees were forced to turn out their pockets by the Nazis. They forced him to labor in a stable for a few weeks before taking him to a larger camp where he was forced to sleep in a chilly tent. Comparatively, the Polish inmates were treated fairly well, but the Jewish prisoners were treated appallingly squalid. Many of them felt ill and had frostbite as a result of the extreme cold. Wlodek began exercising and praying every day in order to maintain his strength. With the help of the other inmates, he devised and constructed an elaborate chess set from stones and breadcrumbs. He was allowed to write to his girlfriend, Anya, in German, once a week. When the German laborers were called to the front, an announcement was made that the inmates may volunteer for work assignments to replace them. Wlodek chose to register, despite the skepticism of his fellow inmates. For the first time, the convicts were able to live in their own homes and consume real meals. In little time at all, the inmates were put to work leveling the ground. Some of the captives were forced to return to the POW camp, where they starved and froze to death rather than work under Nazi rule. Wlodek gets a dream of his deceased grandfather, who assures him that he would overcome this difficulty on the Parshas Truma day. Art inquires about Parshas Truma, and Wlodek explains that a Parsha is a segment of the Torah, and that 1 week each year is designated as Parshas Truma. It was 3 months later when he asked the local rabbi when he would be able to hear Parshas Truma being read. A troop of German soldiers arrived at the camp 3 months later and freed the inmates. The next day, Wlodek was loaded onto a train and taken to Lublin, Poland. He is told that the Nazis slaughtered a bunch of released prisoners the day before, and he is being imprisoned there as a result. That the Germans have been persuaded to release inmates who can be claimed by a relative in the town is what the Jewish officials informed Wlodek. It's agreed that they'll state that the guy is Wlodek's cousin instead than his family friend. Wlodek was shot at by a security as he went to the bathroom that night. He was able to go into the tent without any injuries. Having been released into the hands of his family acquaintance, Wlodek began preparing how he could slip back into Sosnowiec to see his family again soon after. Despite his lack of legal documents, Wlodek was able to board a train in the desired route and convince the Polish railroad man to allow him to go. Despite a curfew imposed on the town's Jewish population by the Nazis, Wlodek is able to return home and enjoy the holiday with his family. As Art prepares to leave, Wlodek takes a break from telling the tale. Upon learning that Art is in search of his coat, Wlodek informs him that he felt it was worn out and tossed it out. As a gesture of goodwill, Wlodek gives Art one of his coats to wear on the way home, knowing how angry he makes Art. Chapter 4, The Noose Titans. The next day, when Art gets home, his father starts telling him stories about his own experiences in the POW camp. When he and Anya moved into her parents' house, he and Anya had to follow the stringent laws that the Nazis had imposed on Jews. During World War II, the Nazis seized control of Wlodek's factory, along with all Jewish-owned enterprises. With the help of shops who owed him money, Wlodek attempted to get his business back on track. When the Nazis close his street and begin requesting work papers from the store owners, he has some success. About half of the shop owners don't have them, and they're taken away from the others. Wlodek eludes capture by slipping away without being discovered. Wlodek is taken to a friend of Anya's father's who can provide him with a priority work card for the illicit market. The situation in Poland deteriorated steadily during the next year. Material goods were confiscated from the homes of Jews by the Nazis at this time. Sosnowiec's Jews were evacuated to a tiny area in 1941, and Anya, Vladek, and the rest of her family were given a two-bedroom house. Vladek continued to maintain his tiny textile business until 3 other retailers that he did business with were hanged by the Nazis for operating without a coupon. It was because of this fear that Vladek began trading in gold and jewels instead of doing business. All Jews above the age of 70 were ordered to be sent to a town in Czechoslovakia by the Nazis soon after. It was a matter of time before Anya's grandparents would be taken away from her. So as not to split up her extended family, they created an underground bunker in her backyard and put her grandparents inside. They could care for them there. Anya's father was eventually taken away in the place of her grandparents by a group called the Jewish Police, a group of Jewish men who had joined the German police to avoid being expelled. For fear of losing Anya's mother, the family was forced to leave up their grandparents' hideout. Auschwitz, the notorious Nazi concentration camp, was chosen over a trip to Czechoslovakia for the grandparents of one of our relatives. Despite the return of Anya's father, the Nazis stated that all Jews in Sosnowiec were had to register at the city's stadium. In the end, many people were more concerned about missing out on their papers than they were about the Nazi trap. When Vladek and his family arrived at the stadium, they noticed that the crowd had been divided into 2 sections: workable and non-workable people. They were thrown away from the stadium because they didn't have their passports stamped. This includes Vladek's father, who was first allowed to be in the good side but snuck into the bad side to be with his wife, Vladek. The story is now over for Vladek, so Art goes to bed without interfering. During the conversation, Mala informs Art that her mother was also kidnapped from the stadium and transported to a packed apartment building where some people were committing suicide in order to get out of there. Her mother, Mala's mother, died in Auschwitz after Mala smuggled her out of the building. Having been told by Vladek that Anya had kept diaries during this time period, Art sets out to locate them. However, he is unable. Vladek drives Mala crazy, and she gets angry when he starts looking. Chapter 5, Mouse Holes. His father begs Art to help him replace a damaged drain pipe when he calls him in the wee hours of the morning. The only reason he became an artist is because his father thought it was impractical to help him mend things, he tells his wife. During his explanation, his father returns the call and tells him that he is going to enlist the assistance of his neighbor. In 1 week's time, Art arrives to find his father furious at home. Talking to Mala, he learns that Art had produced a comic strip about Vladek's mother, Anya, years previously. As Art reveals in the comic, his mother committed suicide, and he blames himself for it. Anya's death has brought up memories for Vladek, who has shared this with his son. As Vladek continues his tale, the two walk together to the bank. All of the remaining Jews in Sosnowiec were expelled to Stradula in 1943, where they were forced to live in squalid conditions. As a result, they were forced to pay the locals in Poland to move into their vacant homes. German forces marched all of Stradula's Jewish residents to work every day and forced them to work in German shops. For Richu and the other youngsters in town, a friend offered a safe haven from the Nazis by transporting them back to his homeland. As far as Vladek is concerned, there are no Jewish people over the age of 90 left in the country who haven't been rounded up and sent away. It is agreed upon by the families, and their children are removed. As Vladek recalls, that was the final time he saw his son before he died. The Nazis sent roughly 1,000 youngsters from Stradula to Auschwitz not long after they were given to a friend. Vladek talks about Rich's death and what he found out later. It wasn't long before the Germans executed the guy who had shielded him in Zawirsy. In order to avoid Auschwitz, a mother poisoned herself and her other children, including Richu, to ensure their safety. As soon as the Germans returned to Stradula, they started arresting people even though they had been registered. To escape this, Vladek built a hideout in the cellar of their home. While the Germans hunted for them, the family hid in the little bunker for days. As the Nazis launched their purge of Stradula, they began to remove its residents. They stayed in the bunker for this period of time, escaping only to get food. A thief breaks into the house one day, and the family manages to apprehend him. It was revealed to him that he was merely relaxing and that he was looking for food in order to provide for his family. They believe what he says and give him some food because of it. As soon as he's gone, the Nazis show up, having learned about the family's secret hiding place from him. When the vehicle arrived, The family was put in a holding area until they could be brought to Auschwitz. They made a deal with a relative of Vladek's to help them get out of the country while they were there. With the exception of Anya's dad, everyone in the family managed to flee. After sneaking back into Sverdula, Vladek and Anya were aided by Vladek's cousin Haskell to find work sewing shoes for the German soldiers. Suddenly, Vladek feels faint and has to pause and take one of his medicines while he explains how he learned that the man who turned them in had later been shot. He tells Art that Haskell is still alive and well in Poland as he starts to heal. As a card player and gambler, Haskell became a favorite of Germans because he frequently lost enormous sums of money. Vladek's life was frequently saved by Haskell's local renown. There was a steady stream of vehicles carrying individuals to the concentration camps while the Nazis continued to destroy the town. A bunker was built within the shoe factory by Vladek and his cousin so that they could keep their families safe. Anya's sadness returned when Vladek and Anya learned their kid had died. Because Vladek convinced her that she was important to him and that they had to die together, she did not commit suicide. About a dozen people, including Vladek and Anya, entered the shoe factory's bunker, which is located in the basement. They quickly ran out of food. Some of the men in the bunker confided in Vladek that they had negotiated a deal with the troops to get out of town. When Vladek saw the trap, he refused to leave. After they'd walked away, Vladek saw them being shot at from above. Only the Polish residents remained after the town was swept out. People who remained in the bunker exited and went their separate ways. Having lost their entire family, Anya and Vladek set out on their own with no idea where they were going. Except for the Polish residents, the community was eventually emptied away. People who remained in the bunker exited and went their separate ways. Having lost their entire family, Anya and Vladek set out on their own with no idea where they were going. Chapter 6, Mousetrap. Mala and Vladek are squabbling over money the next time Art visits his father. Art tells Mala that he concerns that the portrayal of his father in the graphic novel may come off as a racist caricature of a Jewish person. For the sake of the book's overall balance, he regrets not interviewing his mother about what transpired during the war. After Art and Vladek leave the house, the drama continues in the garden. On a whim, Vladek and Anya slipped away from Sverdula in 1944 and made their way to Sosnovitz. Unsure of where to go, they decided to try to get to Anya's father's place. The janitor still resided there as he was a Polish man. For his part, they agreed to let him in and hide them. While pretending to be a Polish man the next morning, Vladek set out on a mission to find other Poles living in the town. The janitor warned him that if he concealed in the house for an extended period of time, he would be discovered. For money, Vladek and his pals could find a woman who would conceal them in a rural area outside of town for a few days. As long as they stated they didn't know her if the Nazis came by, the woman agreed to let them stay in her barn. When Vladek couldn't locate food in the wilderness, he made friends with a woman who volunteered to let them remain in her home. The mother had a little boy who loved Anya's company, but they feared that he would inadvertently leak information about them to his school. The woman's house was situated on the ground floor, so it was tougher to hide inside since they could be seen from the street. She told Vladek and Anya that they had to flee because of the Nazis raiding her food stand one day. The pair spent hours wandering around Sosnovitz, unsure of what to do next. A woman outside town consented to let them stay at her property after they slept in the worksite the night before. In response to Vladek's request for assistance in leaving Poland, she informed him of a man she knew who had been smuggled into Hungary. In exchange for connecting them with the people in Hungary who can help them get into the country, she says she'll put them in touch with the people who can help them get into the country. They only handed the couple over to German authorities because Anya had reason to be suspicious of the smugglers. Having been kidnapped at Bielsko, where he had formerly owned his factory, Vladek and Anya were led around the town before being separated and transported to Auschwitz on a vehicle. Finally, after nearly an hour of telling the story, Vladek stops, and Art inquires about the search for Anya's diaries. In an interview, Vladek confesses that he burnt them after she took her own life. Because of this, Art loses his cool and screams at his father. The boy acts calm and tells his father he has to leave, but inside he is cursing and calling his dad a murderer. Art Spiegelman, the author and artist of the graphic novel. The story of his father's stay in Poland during World War II is conveyed to the reader through the medium of a comic book because of the power of art. Art's life and character development are given scant attention. By the time he begins the novel, we can assume that he is an adult with a wife. Art, who was born and raised in the United States and has no first-hand knowledge of the atrocities of World War II, has no idea what his father has been through. Because he was aware that his father would regard being a professional comics artist as an impossibility, Art admits in the first novel that he was drawn to the prospect of becoming one. Throughout most of his life, Art and his father had a tense relationship and he felt isolated from him. Wladek Spiegelman. One could argue that Wladek is the novel's central character. The book's main focus is on his time in Poland during World War II and the infamous Auschwitz concentration camp, which he describes in his own words and perspective. Wladek is a sharp and intelligent man who makes do during the war with his wits and cunning. That his father used chance and resourcefulness to survive in Auschwitz does not erase the terrible feelings that Art had built up over a lifetime for him, he informs his therapist at one point in the book. When Art was a child, Wladek had a very different relationship with him than he had with his son. Wladek clearly adores his son and cherishes the time he gets to spend with him. His lack of understanding of Art's dissatisfaction with him and the ways in which Art has defined him belies his seeming ignorance of these issues. As a result of his life's hardships, Wladek is wounded both physically and psychologically. However, he appears to put on an air of acceptance in the novels and this fragility is evident in little ways. Anya Spiegelman, Art's mother. Due to her death by suicide before the start of the novel, Wladek is the only one to see Anya in the present day. Only Wladek's recollections and suppositions about Anya's feelings can be used to depict her thoughts and feelings. Anya kept meticulous notebooks and records of events during the conflict, which Wladek destroyed after her death. This is despite the fact that Anya is depicted as a vivacious persona. Richu's birth foreshadows her mental condition, as she suffers from postpartum depression. Anya is a courageous character who perseveres through the horrors of Auschwitz and the murder of her small son. While waiting for her husband's homecoming in Sosnowiec, she makes her own way back there on her own. Françoise Spiegelman, Art's wife. Art depicts the French as frogs, in keeping with the slur they've earned for themselves, but French woman Françoise insists on being represented as a mouse instead because she recently converted to Judaism. In the 21st century, Françoise is a forward-thinking lady who is kind to her father-in-law while also being firm when it comes to dealing with his outmoded notions. On February 15, 1948, in Stockholm, Sweden, Art Spiegelman was born. After being sent to Auschwitz, the world's most notorious and lethal concentration camp, the Nazis expelled Spiegelman's parents from Poland. When his parents brought him to the United States in 1951, they changed his name from Itzhak Avraham Ben-Ziv to Arthur Isidore. In 1957, the family relocated from Norristown, Pennsylvania, to Queens, New York City, where they raised their children. Art started creating comics in 1960 by mimicking the art styles of some of his favorite comic books at the time. High school art sales gained him notice from the United Features Syndicate, which offered him a syndicated comic strip. He turned it down because he felt that it was too commercial for him to accept it. To get started, Art went to Manhattan's High School for the Arts and Design and began submitting to local publications. Parents advised Art to choose a more secure and lucrative career after graduating from high school in 1965, but he worked as a freelance cartoonist and began working for Harper College's newspaper. Art was sent to Binghamton State Mental Hospital in 1968 after suffering a mental breakdown. His mother, Anya, took her own life not long after he was freed from prison. Art relocated to San Francisco in 1971, when he became involved with the underground comics movement. When Art was working in the underground comics scene, he published his work in men's magazines and underground publications from 1970 to 1977. While working on a comic for Funny Animals, he began to think about his most famous work, Mouse, which was published in the magazine. The following year, Art returned to New York City, where he met his wife, Françoise Molly. Nadia, born in 1987, and Dashiell, born in 1992, are the couple's two children. Once Raw was established as the first issue of Mouse, the pair decided to start producing a new publication together. Wladek Spiegelman died just 2 years after the first issue of Mouse was released in 1982. Raw finished in 1991, and after that, Art started looking for a publisher to put together a Mouse graphic novel collection. A compilation of his comic books came out later that year, and he was successful. His first full-length children's book was released in 1997, and he worked for The New Yorker for the next 10 years. With his wife, he currently resides in New York City. Thank you for listening in Audiobook Academy. Don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button for more content like this. See you in next video.